Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another Ontario provincial election forecast. Now, before I begin, I'd like to once again mention that I am running a poll for Canada Federal, Quebec Provincial, Ontario Provincial, and if I get enough respondents, Newfoundland Provincial. I have enough respondents for Quebec and Ontario to make it work. More respondents will obviously increase data accuracy and data quality, so by all means, keep responding. But those two will definitely get done. Newfoundland, I need a lot more. That was dubious to begin with. And the other thing I want to mention before I begin the rest of the video is at the end of the month, for the next 3 months, for the first quarter, I am experimenting with like a monthly live stream Q&A kind of deal. So if you have any questions you want for that, tag it with Q&A in the comments. Or if you prefer, I will hire priority to super chats or super stickers or whatever they're called, and all channel members will get channel members at Everything Bagel or higher will get a free question. But with that, let us begin. So, Doug Ford is just dominant. We've kind of waffled back and forth every now and then in the polls in Ontario, where sometimes Ford is weak, but still winning. Sometimes he's ascendant, crushing, gaining seats, gaining vote share. And at this point, we have waffled into the other position, the strongest position. So we kind of see here my tracking of this since January 8th last year. I meant to have a fall update, but I didn't get around to it because I was too busy with every other election happening at the exact same time. I had it planned for November, and then the Nova Scotia election took the time slot. Well, you can see since January 8th last year, Ford is up nearly 6 points. This was just after January 8th last year. Crombie took the leadership, and things were... Did I do this math correctly? 1 second. Okay, apologies. I had the math on the spreadsheet being calculated wrong. But point still stands. You can see at this point, when Crombie becomes the leader of the Ontario Liberals, they're doing the best they've done in a while. They're up 3 points from the last election. If we go to seat trends, they're sitting at 15 or so seats, so they're not doing too bad seat-wise. But then over the course of 2024, as Crombie's new leadership bump starts fading away, things kind of get worse. Down to 26.7 in June, and now a year later we're 25.9. Now, she's still up from Del Duca, and seat-wise, she's up 4 seats from Del Duca. I think this puts her at official party status. So it is definitely a better result for the Ontario Liberals, but it's not a good result for the Ontario Liberals. Things are not going well for them. But the big story here isn't the Ontario Liberals. It's really the Ontario NDP. The Ontario NDP has been stuck. The entirety of last year, they just kind of bounced around where they are. And now they're down about a point-ish, maybe 1.2. I'm not sure how real that is. That could just be noise. They could be still around 22. My model is not immune from noise because obviously data underneath it can be noisy. But the key thing there is they actually got 23.3% in 2022. So by the end over the course of the year of 2024, they were were doing better than their 2022 numbers, and now they're nearly 2 points below them. Over 2 points below them. You look at seats, it's even more abysmal. They started the year last year at 23 seats, and they're starting this year at 18 seats, being slaughtered in the north and south and Toronto. Even losing seats in Toronto. Sorry, not Toronto. Even losing places like Windsor West at the risk of losing London to the PCs. And that really shouldn't surprise anyone who's followed this, my coverage, or Ontario politics. This really boils down very heavily to specifically the Ontario NDP's decision to not have a leadership race and to crown Marit Stiles. Stiles was always going to be a bad option to follow up Andrea Horwath because she's very similar to Andrea Horwath. There's no point in replacing a party's leader if the next leader is just the same person. Really, the only ideological difference between the two of them is there's none. At least none that I can see. None that they have displayed in their actions. They're basically the same leader. Other than their name, other than their face. And after, 3 cycles, Horwath had burned out any possibility she was going to be in a stronger position. The Ontario NDP's best shot was 2018 of governing in the last little bit. And they blew it. Doug Ford won. 2022 they did worse. Now they're going to do worse yet again. And the big issue that's really killing the Ontario NDP, they've been a bit more resistant to this than the federal kind. Because the Ontario Party has done a better job of retaining the union vote, but as we're seeing we saw in 2022, a lot of the unions had started switching to Ford. Not all of them yet, but many of them did. And where this is really hitting them is places like Niagara, London, Windsor, or heck, even to an extent Hamilton. These are very unionized cities. I mean, at least relative to the country at large. And these are traditional working class areas. You could also say Oshawa area is another one. And a lot of these areas are switching over to right-wing parties. Either Doug Ford's party or Poilievre's party. And the cross weakness between both the Ontario NDP and the federal NDP is not coincidence. We're even seeing this in Northern Ontario too. The NDP, in a very broad sense, east of the border of Manitoba and Ontario, has heavily lost their identity. And you could also possibly even say this is also true in BC. Originally, the NDP was the party of unionized workers and soft socialist farmer types. Now, when I say that, I don't mean the farmers were socialist, but they supported collective co-op-y things that farming communities benefit from or they like. For example, if you're in a very small town, having co-ops or etc. helps keep wealth in the town, helps keep stuff in the town, or you have things like crop insurance and stuff like that to protect from ups and downs. There is reasons and benefits that the NDP used to appeal to these people. It's the reason why Saskatchewan used to be very orange as a province. They didn't win the farmers, but they did better with them. And they did very well with the resource workers because they were unionized. But now, in 2025, and over the last decade really, the NDP has been shedding that base. Partially on purpose, partially just kind of a self-feeding loop. As the party had the perception of being very left-wing, or at least more left-wing than the Liberals, a lot of young progressive types from universities joined politics and went to the NDP because they perceived it as the quote-unquote left-wing party. And as they went to the quote-unquote left-wing party, they brought their urbanite progressive viewpoints to the party. Whereas the party before was, again, a working class, in a lot of senses, fairly rural party. You look at Nova Scotia pre-2013, when this kind of transition happened under Gerald Dexter in Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia NDP would win seats in places like Pictou County. They would win places on the South Shore. Because a lot of fishing communities have the same kind of relation that farming communities have. They're a little more communitarian than cities are. But this trend has really gutted the NDP to the point where outside of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, and it is affecting those three provinces too, it's just affecting them slower because the NDP in those three provinces represents the only opposition party, and the urban areas are not dominant enough that the parties can ignore everything else. Though it is hurting those three provincial parties as well. But you look at, say, BC, where the urban areas in the Vancouver metro are large enough, as we just saw in 2025 or 2024's election, that as long as the BC NDP holds most of Vancouver Island and most of the Vancouver metro, they win the election. They can lose almost the rest of the province, and they still win. And that kind of polarization really pulls to this self-ratcheting cycle. As the party gets perceived as more left-wing, they lose more of these rural or small town factions. The fishermen, farmers, resource workers, working class guys. They lose these people and they gain more urbanite progressives, more low-level white-collar or service worker in cities. When I say low-level white-collar, I mean like closer to entry level or like your average accountant kind of thing. I'm not saying accountants necessarily, but that's the kind of vibe I'm going for. Like, not the managers. For the most part, they don't vote NDP. And it's not necessarily the really high-end white-collar jobs like engineers or doctors. They don't really vote NDP that much. Sometimes some medical professions do, but not as much as you would think. But I digress. So, and then in Eastern Canada, it's even worse. You look at places like New Brunswick and the NDP's dead. You look at PEI and the NDP basically never existed because the PCs and the Liberals had already dominated any niche the NDP could have. In Nova Scotia, it's basically irrelevant. Yes, technically the NDP is the official opposition, but they don't matter. In their current formulation with their current platform, they have no appeal outside of urban Halifax. They barely are winning seats in Sydney area now. They almost lost Cape Breton Centre, Whitney Pier. Newfoundland, they've never really done very well outside of St. John, with an asterisk on that because I've not looked at every single election, but of the ones in my lifetime, they've not done very well outside of St. John. And even then, in St. John, they're not doing great. It's not like they're winning meaningful seats. Like they get a decent vote share, but they don't really do anything of note in that province. And then in Ontario, they used to have a core base. It was hard for them to expand upon that, but they had a core base. And now they're just flopping. They don't really have a core base. Their voters are very evenly distributed because it turns out these young urbanite progressive types don't actually concentrate or congregate in any particular region. They really diffuse about. And in the few regions where you can say they're concentrated, such as like central Ottawa here or like downtown Toronto, there's actually not enough seats in those regions to really do anything unless there is no other left-wing party. Now, I'm not saying Merritt Stiles would win or beat Doug Ford right now if Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals did not exist. Many of them wouldn't vote. Some of them would vote PC. The Liberal side is that the party didn't exist. But let's say, hypothetically, Stiles is getting something like 35% of the vote if the Liberals don't exist. So they pick up she picks up 60% of the current Liberal voters, kind of thing. Yeah, you would see a lot of downtown Toronto, Scarborough, maybe into the parts of York here. That would probably solidify. Maybe places like Nepean might come back. Maybe some other towns around the province they might do better in. They might be getting in the 30, 40 seat range. Maybe. But you still have the key issue here. That you see the Nova Scotia NDP very clearly, because the Nova Scotia NDP is closer to evolving into this position because of the collapse of the NSLP recently. Though the NSLP, I think, will probably revive, for the record, but we'll see. They don't really have a path. Their appeal is too narrow. It's too specific. It's too concentrated. The urbanite progressive types, let's say, hypothetically, 30% of Ontario voters are this type. You might see places like, say, Toronto Centre or University Rosedale, they might be 80% urban progressive types. So their voter base is just hilariously concentrated in a few ridings, and then everything else they do poorly with. Whereas in the past, this is easier to see in Saskatchewan, when the NDP was really appealing to working class, unionized guys, resource workers, farming communities, they would be winning rural ridings. Not all of them, not even most of them, but they were competitive in winning these ridings. They were winning the towns. They were winning working class areas. But they're not doing that now. And a large part is because of this ratcheting effect of they're perceived as more left-wing, so very left-wing young people attach themselves to the party, get into positions of leadership by either becoming MPs themselves, becoming advisors, becoming campaign managers, becoming staffers. And it ratchets the party more left-wing, perpetuating this cycle. And the way left-wing parties work is if someone doesn't agree with the consensus in the party, as I've touched on in my last video, they are usually pushed out of the party. It's very difficult in a left-wing party to have contrasting visions, contrasting views, even if both people largely have similar ideologies. A good example of this right now is Christy Clark, whether you like her or not, is a liberal. Ideologically, she is a liberal. A neoliberal, perhaps, but she's a liberal. And a lot of liberal types are trying to push her away from the liberal leadership position because the majority of the current liberal base are social liberals. And being a neoliberal is different enough that they don't want her in the party. And it's very difficult for them to sustain it. Because I will emphasize here, this kind of pressure isn't just them saying, oh, I don't want her to be the leader. They're saying she shouldn't be in the party. And that's the challenging aspect here with left-wing parties. This very strong purity spiral tendency in these parties because of how left-wing leadership in party structures work. So, but now that said, I want to stress here, well, whereas the self-ratcheting effect is absolutely a thing that's happening, and it's absolutely driving this. Part of this, too, is intentional leader decisions. And it's not like Andrea Horwath or Marit Stiles are sitting down in their office and being like, how can we antagonize unions? That's not what they're doing. They're not sitting there and being like, how can we alienate resource workers? It's not what they're doing. What they're sitting down and thinking to themselves is, how can we win the progressive vote? How can we win, quote unquote, left wingers? And one of the conclusions they seem to draw time and again in most of the country is fiscal left-wing policies are not productive. They don't seem to really draw voters, and they can't really articulate them in a good way. Or the policies that do seem like they might draw voters are just not practical. They're too expensive. We can't really do them. There's a reason why Trudeau's dental care program is very tepid and very small, because it's extremely expensive. Now, is it a good thing or a bad thing? That's up for you to decide. But there is a reason why it wasn't smashed through as a full universal program like the last major healthcare reform Canada did. We don't have the fiscal capacity. We're already deep in the red, and the economy's not looking so hot, and the population is aging, so it's not practical. It's very difficult, I guess is a better way to say that, to sustain it. So a lot of these parties are seeing this. They have money guys, they have economists, they have finance gurus who sit down, they look at stuff and they say, well, unless we can increase our tax base, we can't really do big social programs. The state would be unfundable. Now, some of these parties, such as the Saskatchewan NDP, looks at this and they try to tweak things around the edges, try to increase fiscal stability, fiscal balance, so they can do more of these in the future. Other parties, such as the Nova Scotia NDP, don't care, and they just YOLO it forward and pretend fiscal stability doesn't matter. But the core thing, they can't really push these big, bold fiscal liberalism or fiscally left-wing policies. The finances just cannot support it. That's why you don't see Jagmeet Singh campaigning on like full universal dental care or full universal child care or any other things. He might say we need to improve this program, and he does. But he's not campaigning on a total change, a total revamp. You'll see most of what Jagmeet Singh campaigns on, or most of what Marit Stiles campaigns on, end up being more of this social variety, because a lot of leaders, a lot of politicians, a lot of campaign strategists have a very warped idea of the political spectrum and of Canada. A lot of people think Canada is a very left-wing place because the last 60 years we've done a reasonably high amount of left-wing policy changes. Though I will note, most of them have been fiscal, not social. Although most of the social changes were done by court fiat, not by popular consent to vote. Such as abortion, such as gay marriage, such as euthanasia, just to name three. So big social changes that did not happen because of Parliament. Or in Nova Scotia's case, for the most part, Sunday shopping was legalized by court order. There's complexities to that, which I won't get into here, because it's not relevant to Ontario. But these politicians and these strategists and these activists conflate these two positions. They think because people have, in the past, supported left-wing fiscal policy, that they support left-wing social policy. And that could not be further from the case. And it doesn't take much to verify this. Because if you think down and look at different communities, it becomes really obvious why this is the case. You don't need sophisticated polling. You don't need complex data analysis. Though those are helpful, don't get me wrong, they're not necessary to see this. As one example here of a case where the polling does also show this, we have this poll from Abacus Data. And Abacus Data broke down, I mean, they're not the first people who have done this, but they did it most recently in the most easiest to compile fashion. They broke down Canada into quadrants, going from progressive to conservative on social issues, progressive to conservative on economic issues. And you'll notice, roughly speaking, most Canadians are slightly or significantly economically progressive, which that means the government should intervene to do things in the economy to make people's lives better. But, equally, a majority, or possibly maybe you could just say plurality, if you want to count this middle segment as neutral, a plurality of voters are socially conservative. There is 46% who are socially conservative, and there is 35% who are socially liberal, the rest being neutral. And then similarly on the economic issues, you have 56% who are economically progressive and 27% who are economically conservative. And people have confused these two positions. So you end up getting a lot of parties like the NDP or the Liberals catering to this part of the political spectrum in Canada because they can't be fully over here. The finances just can't support it. They just can't. The government can't do it. They will not get enough people to lend them money to do this. They can't have a deep enough deficit for long enough to do this. So they're campaigning usually in this vicinity, depending on the party, depending on the election. And that is one of the thinnest, least populated portions of the graph of the electorate. One of the thinnest sections of voters is roughly fiscally neutral and socially liberal. They're socially progressive. Historically, though, the NDP was closer to here. Slightly economically progressive. Sorry, socially progressive. Only slightly. But very economically progressive. So going from over here to over here doesn't seem like a very big change, but if you look at the area that is drawn by these squares, you go from a 12% core base to a 20% core base just by moving 4 squares. And that's the difference from being slightly socially liberal, but very economically progressive, to being very socially liberal and only slightly economically progressive. And that's the change the party's done, because the party realizes they can't be here. Policies on this line are not possible in 2025 Canada. They were possible in 1960 Canada. They're not possible today. So they can't be up here. They just can't govern there. And lying to your voters is worse than trying to just offer them more lukewarm policies. But the correct or better decision would have been to say, go here. Instead, they went more socially liberal. And that is a thinner part of the graph. Because these 4 squares, again, that's 18%, this is 12. So this is a much denser part of the graph. This is a less dense part of the graph. But you don't even need to use sophisticated polling or more complicated data modeling like that. You can just go a more natural thing. What is a farming community? Communitarian, but usually very socially conservative. What is a fishing community? Same thing. What about unionized workers? Again, usually communitarian, and communitarian here being like soft, economically progressive. They support pro-community policymaking, which does involve spending money to better the community. But unionized workers are a very temperamentally conservative group. They don't like big social changes. For example, immigration has never played well with unionized workers. It serves, quite literally, as a method to undercut the union. To make it harder to unionize. It's hard to unionize if you cannot talk to everyone easily. And having many, many languages being spoken, or a lot of people being able to speak English or French worse than other people, makes it harder to unionize. Business does use this on purpose. And this kind of change, you can see this doesn't play as well at the core base because these people are more conservative on social issues, temperamentally. And that's not surprising because, again, the plurality of Canadians are firmly socially conservative, at least somewhat. Many are neutral, sure, but most plurality is slightly socially conservative, as we saw in the graph from Abacus. So a lot of this changes just ends up narrowing the base for the NDP. And it ends up narrowing the base for any left-wing party that falls into this trap. Now, what you see conversely with, say, the Ontario Liberal Party is usual, like you see this with all liberal parties. They kind of bounce around different flavors of liberalism, depending on which the current leader is. And Crombie is more closer maybe to right liberalism. I'm not going to say necessarily that she is a right liberal herself, but she's closer to it than social liberalism. But her problem, and the problem a lot of liberals have, is again, since they really try to avoid touching these social conservative policies, and it's not so much they try to avoid this, they actively counter-signal it, they struggle in 2025 to appeal to these voters. When you see Trudeau or the Liberal Party running ads about how the Conservatives are going to take away abortion, or they had a recent one where Quali is anti-gay marriage, which isn't true, but it doesn't matter. You see these ads, and you think, a lot of politicals think, this is a good ad. Like, this is really hitting Trudeau, or sorry, Poilievre. It's like, no, it doesn't in any way, shape, or form. You might think that because as a politico, as a commentator, you have very strong opinions about these things, and you're more into the kind of savvy hit-back policies. But what that speaks to the individual voter, when they see that ad, they're seeing, I don't really care that much about this. Or, I don't really believe Poilievre was going to do that. So, like, why are you fussing about that? I don't care. You might think to yourselves, let's say you're in this, let's take the gay marriage ad, for example. Actually, I'll bring it up. Bring up this ad right here.
Well, I look back at everything I've done for my entire political career to the time I was a teenager, and I've been saying precisely the same thing the entire time.
Marriage ought to be preserved as a union between one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others.
Well, I look...
Now, politicos and people who are really into this stuff might see that and think, haha, They hit the Poilievre. They gave him a big slap. They pointed out his hypocrisy. They slapped him in the face. Haha, we did it. We did the thing. Average voters see ads like that, and they think to themselves, like, I don't care. Why does that affect me? Or, very importantly, in the year of our Lord, 2025, the economy is not so great. I can't buy a house. I can't. My job's not keeping up with inflation. Groceries are so expensive. Now, some of these things might be perceptions more than reality, but that doesn't matter. Perception is reality when it comes to politics. And what the end result there is, isn't that they're actually hitting Poilievre, or they're hitting Doug Ford, they're hitting Danielle Smith, or whatever leader they're currently attacking. They're not actually undermining or hurting them. What they're doing is telling voters, we care more about social issues that you don't care about than we care about economic issues that you do care about. And this goes into a topic I touch on all the time, and I'll just briefly touch on again here. It's this concept of negative polarization. So the way negative polarization works is you have a party that's deeply unpopular, the Liberal Party, and then you have another party, the Conservative Party, and you have another leader, your Poilievre, who are relatively popular. And then you associate a position that people don't have strong opinions about, in this case gay marriage, with yourself, and you associate the opposite position with your opponent. And what that does, maybe to some voters, they'll no longer vote for the Conservative Party. Some of them might. Some of them might switch to the Liberals. They might switch to NDP. Or they might leave the electorate. That might happen for some voters. But more voters are going to see that and think, oh, wait a minute. If I don't like the Liberals and they like this thing, and I like the Conservatives and they don't like this thing, well, maybe I'm wrong about this thing. Maybe I should be with the Conservatives on this thing. Maybe I should agree with them on this thing. And this happens because they dislike the Liberals more than they care about the issue being presented. So by associating this issue that they don't care about with the party they dislike, they are going to dislike that issue. That's why it's very, very difficult to campaign on social issues. Because most people are very neutral on social issues. There's no big, broad body of people who deeply care about abortion. There are definitely people who do care about that topic. Don't get me wrong. But we're talking about maybe 20% of the electorate on pro and anti. Most people don't have a strong opinion about it. But as soon as you start associating yourself with a strong opinion on it, and the people don't like you, they'll stop liking that position. It's divisive, if you will. And this can work in certain circumstances, but usually it doesn't work. Usually this is a self-defeating campaign premise, a self-defeating idea. Now, is this to say that we are going to see the Conservatives do anything on, say, gay marriage? No. Absolutely not. Does that mean it's going to hurt its approval in the public? Yeah, it's probably going to start showing up in polls. We're seeing in polls that abortion is getting less popular. Apologies for that sound. And this will likely happen with other topics that the Liberals try to attack the Conservatives for, when the Conservatives are not campaigning on doing those things. And likely won't actually do those things when they're in government either, regardless of what the Liberals say. The Liberals can attack Ford or Poilievre or anyone else for all these things. The NDP could as well. But if they don't do them, well, then you make efforts to do them. You just get a silly situation. Well, that I bid you guys all adieu, and I'll see you next time with something else.